Hello, is this a good volume? Hi, I'm Alison Shields, and I will be leading this next panel. Just to tell you a bit about myself and a bit of an introduction on how this panel came to be. I am an assistant professor of art education at UVic, and I'm also a PhD candidate in curriculum pedagogy at UBC. And I'm just finishing up my dissertation, so this panel came at a great time to bring it all together. So again, thank you to Alison and Marina, as well as Catherine at the VAG for bringing me to be part of this. So I'm going to give a bit of introduction to my work to set up how we're talking about things in this panel. So the title of the panel is In the Studio, Painting as Thinking, Painting as Conversation. Throughout the past 3 years, my doctoral research in curriculum pedagogy at the University of British Columbia has taken me on a cross-Canada journey, visiting over 125 artists, specifically painters, in their studios. The accompanying images are photographs I took along this research trip. As an artist and researcher within art education, my concern was on the hows and whys of painting, the process of painting within the studio, and the motivations of the artists. As a painter, this has been one of the most rewarding and generative experiences I have had. I view the studio as a private space, a personal space, and often an intimate space. It is also a space of process, a space of experimentation, and a space of searching. While artists often open their studio to visitors, curators, critics, and other artists, I still feel that this invitation to enter a studio is a privilege. As many of the artists whom I met with are here today, including my panelists, I would like to thank you all for inviting me into your space and for sharing your thinking and working process with me. I was led throughout this journey by my own curiosity and passion for painting, and each space, story, and painting allowed me to further engage with my ongoing question, why paint, and how do our ideas, experiences, material explorations, curiosities, and questions become manifested through painting in the studio. Describing the studio as a heterotopia, Vancouver-based artist Fiona Ackerman described a studio as both a workplace and an anti-workplace, the real and the imaginary. In an interview with artist Sandra Meeks, she similarly said that a great piece of art can transport us elsewhere to a different world. For me, the artist studio functions in a similar way. It has the capacity to take us somewhere else. Artist Andrea Kastner explained that a studio is similar to a workplace, except that it is full of portals and links that don't exist in other spaces. In her case, these links exist in the form of paintings. Montreal-based painter David Elliott described that other place. Quote, "When it comes to art, painting specifically, I like the notion of a parallel world. I like the notion of a parallel space, whether it's the space you visit when you dream, a space you imagine, a space you feel when you're in love, whatever that enriched world is, it's that kind of heightened reality, which is like a parallel space." Over the course of my studio visits, artists compared their studios to a stage, a playground, a laboratory, a waiting room, a puzzle, a cabinet of curiosities, a pressure cooker, a collage, and a brain. Each of these metaphors allowed me to consider the various ways of thinking and making that emerge within the studio. Artists and professors in the United Kingdom, Rebecca Fortnum and Elizabeth Fisher, performed a study interviewing artists and found that not knowing was at the core of art making for these artists. In their book, and drawing from their research, they argue that not knowing is not only something to overcome, but sought, explored, and savored, where failure, boredom, frustration, and getting lost are constructively deployed alongside wonder, secrets, and play. As I first analyzed my interviews, I saw similar discussions emerge. Montreal-based artist Dil Hildebrand said painting was like trying to find someone in a crowd without knowing what they looked like. It's an ongoing process of getting lost. He said, "It's like a walk in the wilderness where you don't know where you're going, and every decision is based on what's there right now. It's not based on a map that gets you to where you are going. I don't have a map. I'm just walking through the woods and making decisions. There are problems with that because sometimes you get lost. I get lost each and every time. In Montreal, Janet Werner talked about the connection between getting lost and creativity. She said, "Ultimately, you always learn from that experience of being lost, because otherwise, how are you going to find yourself? I think of the creative process like digging a hole and having to find your way out of it." One artist said painting is about finding problems that can't be solved, and another said it is about searching for unanswerable questions. And in my visit with Ottawa-based artist Carol Wainio, she referred to multiple universe theory, which states that at each decision, one could go in multiple directions. She describes how through her work emerges through the process. She says, "What happens in there is that there's a space that gets created, and then elements get put into that space to see what those elements can possibly say to each other, or how they can inform one another." While in first analysis, I focused largely on that solitary process of art making in the studio, I also couldn't help but notice the webs of connections that exist between artists separated across this vast country. Whether it is through forming direct relationships through exhibitions, residencies, education, or by indirectly drawing from similar ideas or artists, I came to see painting across Canada as a web of connections and relationships. Lane Relia referred to this system of connections in which each studio practice is embedded as a network. Toronto-based artist Monica Tapp highlighted how painters are situated within this web in her interview when she said, "These paintings are phrases that are uttered. They are parts of a conversation that extends beyond us. It's not just the conversation you have with the canvas, but it's the conversation that came before it that allows the painting to exist. This painting may help to move the conversation forward, and it might just be in a tiny way, but it doesn't exist on its own. And it is this generosity that I think is a necessity at the heart of art making." I preferred this term conversation to network, as it refers to how we actively participate in these conversations as we make. Thus, through my examination of studio visits with artists, I have come to describe the process of painting in the studio as a conversation. It is a conversation with the work, through material exploration, a conversation with ourselves, and conversation with others. I'm drawn to the term conversation as a way of engaging with this ongoing process of painting as we engage with materials, images, ideas, and others. Some of the words used by artists that alluded to types of conversations that emerged in my interviews were encounter, provoke, interrogate, interrupt, improvise, negotiate, breaking the ice, chatter, speaking, confront, yell, silence, lying, hosting. Eliza Griffiths in Montreal, for example, referred to her painting as a process of call and response, and Sarah Hartland Rose said her paintings are filled with chatter. Artists described how we need to listen to what the painting is telling us to understand its mood, and another said she knows a painting is done when it stops yelling at her. Artists talked about how their work was in conversation with other artists or in dialogue with theoretical discourse or current events. They told me about memories of a first painting that affected them in childhood and how those works still seeped into their studio and paintings. One artist explained how through her paintings she was improvising with artists from the past. And at a cabin once occupied for 70 years by artist Doris McCarthy in Scarborough, artist in residence Erin Terrell explained that she could feel her ghost inhabiting the space. What I find interesting about the way that artists frame these conversations is that the language used to highlight the variety of types of interactions and encounters one can have through painting. Describing the painting as a conversation allowed me to consider the emergent, intuitive, and generative qualities of painting, while also considering the active and intentional decision-making process that occurs while in the studio. It also highlights the relationship between the private and the social, both of which work together within painting practices. Lisa Wainwright, professor at the Art Institute of Chicago, describes the importance of the studio space for the creative process. She says, "The studio is a space and a condition wherein creative play and progressive thinking yield propositions for reflecting on who we are, individually and collectively, and where we might go next. Through my research, I sought to examine this process that Wainwright proposes. Today, I'm excited to have the opportunity to engage with these questions, ideas, and processes in conversation with 3 artists I interviewed. The first, Victoria-based artist Sandra Meeks, in the middle there. The second, Berlin-based artist Jessica Groome. And the third, Ottawa-based artist Jinny Yu, as we continue to ask questions about why paint, what does painting do, and what happens when we engage with painting in the studio. I realized that there was, for some reason, weird gaps between images at points, but so I think there might just be a few more images. And then I'll introduce our first panelist. I'll kind of go through these quickly. All right, our first panelist, Sandra Meeks, born in Baltimore. Meigs studied at the Rhode Island School of Design, the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, and Dalhousie University. In 2015, she received a Governor General's Award in Visual Arts and the Gershon Iskowitz Prize at the AGO. Recently retired, Meigs taught at the University of Victoria for 24 years, influencing generations of painters. Through her work, she interweaves painting with sculpture, film, and sound to create vivid, immersive, and enigmatic paintings.
Okay. Got my clock. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. How do you work this thing? Like that kind of thing? Okay. Oh, there's a clock right there. Okay. I'm going to explore an idea with you that articulates the artist's studio as a model of the universe. In this model, the artist's existence and practice within her studio parallels the existence of self within the universe. I've gotten these ideas from an essay that Merleau-Ponty wrote in 1964 called I and Mind, near the end of his book, The Primacy of Perception. Using painting in his essay as a model for the I, his essay describes a worldview in which perception itself is a means through which the individual subject, through her conscious bodily experience, establishes herself as an integrated part of the world. And this idea also has an elegant parallel in ancient Eastern philosophies and also in quantum physics. The introduction to these ideas are really well covered in a book called The Tao of Physics, published in 1975 and written by Fritjof Capra. So, Microsoft PowerPoint has encountered a problem. So I've drawn up a bunch of cartoons that might help explain the words in a simple fashion. And I'll show you them. Thanks. So in his essay, Merleau-Ponty addresses Descartes' view, first of all, which surmised that our visions are simply the mind receiving projections of the world straight to the mind, wherein the mind and the world are completely separate entities, and the mind simply received projections of the world in the form of ideas. Merleau-Ponty wrote, "Seeing is not a certain mode of thought or the presentation of thought to the self. It is the means given for me being absent from myself, for being present from within, at the fission of being, only at the end of which, at the fission of being, only at the end of which do I close up into myself. The eye sees the world and what it would need to be a painting, sees what keeps a painting from being itself, sees on the palette the colors awaited by the painting, and I'm going to call these colors goop, and sees, once it is done, the painting that answers to all these inadequacies, just as it sees the painting of others as other answers to other inadequacies. So here's a Merleau-Pontian view of perception. So the idea here is that painting is a model of the interaction between the self and the world outside the self. Or more accurately, this new way of looking at things in which the self and the world combine. And to further this analogy, I will contain the artist within her studio and have the world and the studio as the universe, the artist-painter self as one with the studio universe. Vision is the body opening onto the world and the world opening onto the body, with a constant back and forth between and within the body-world studio universe. So I want to illustrate this model by walking you through the development of a few series of works, all of which originated in my own personal experiences. This process of formation resulting from travel, research, distillation of experiences, and finally putting colored goop onto a surface, in my own mind, is analogous to the matter of the universe coming together in dynamic, energetic events in time and space. This is an image of a bed and breakfast in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a historic mansion from the early 20th century. I was really interested in the time around 2007 in stick and shingle style architecture to explore in my paintings. So I went to Newport because it has many of these mansions existing in good condition. So I saw this as an opportunity to explore the paintings themselves as a model of the self. And I wanted to bring the painting to actually contain the self and then convey the painting's self. So the name of that series was called Strange Loop. And I suppose it could be the vitalist fantasy that we were talking about, that Isabel was talking about last night. In that, I very consciously portrayed various selves as you descend. So this image came from this location within this mansion. And I spent a good deal of time taking photographs and doing drawings. And the outcome were paintings that contained beings. Of course, okay, so they depicted beings. There's not actual beings in there, but it's an analogy. And often my work uses analogy to get at a relationship in thought that is very important to me. So this painting is called Go Down In, and it animates the place where this stairwell with the big grandfather clock to have its own beings. Beings were the world relating back to me, and the stairway descended into a vortex that was an infinite stream of the disappearance of the self into the painting. In 2007, I met Paul, pictured on the left in 2007. He owned a bar in Seattle, and we fell madly in love. And he didn't tell me till 6 months later that he had cancer. So by that time, there was no way out, of course. And the picture on the right is from Paul in 2010. And we were on a train journey in East Germany or the former East Germany, to go to a cancer clinic. And this is the house that we bought together in Victoria, where he was going to move up after he retired from selling his bar. So Paul passed away in January 2011. And here I had the house. And I fell in love with this crawl space underneath the house. And I proceeded to project all of my psychic energy around death and mortality into the crawl space of the house. I had an automatic or spontaneous relationship to the space. The result of that was to use the crawl space as a model for understanding mortality. And I did numerous drawings exploring how to possibly put this into a model for mortality. And the result of that was this painting and a series of works called the Basement Panoramas. So there were 4 of these panoramas, each one depicting a stage of the 1-year grieving process that I went through. One being breathing, one restlessness or insomnia, and the 4th was transformation. So the studio itself during that time was a boiling pot for these 4 works to develop. I directly relate here to the analogy of the studio as the universe, and I believe that is what facilitated my being able to make these works relatable, and in some cases profound to the viewer, rather than simply therapeutic, which these kinds of emotional dwellings and expressions are sometimes seen as. So painting is access to the universe. These images became a universal expression in some cases. So we use colored goop, and goop as medium, and goop as primers and varnishes. Goop is the matter of our time and space. And with the goop, I make pictures. Out of the universe comes my pictures. Out of my pictures comes the universe, in an ever-expanding, infinite explosion of experience that makes this world bigger, bigger, and it just keeps getting bigger. And finally, in 2015, I had put this idea of expanding universe, into a work called All to All. And in this work, I wanted to create a huge, overwhelming experience for the viewer. So I set about making 160 paintings, a bunch of noisemakers, chiming clocks with the hands removed. In All to All, the vibrations of matter and energy came to a heightened state. The gallery was packed to the rafters with paintings, chiming clocks, and revolving cookie tins making a racket. So this was downstairs in the gallery, and upstairs were the bones in golden robes and a giant chow gong, which I played every day. And this was ultimately the intense rise of vibration and energy, and the acknowledgement that the universe and the painter are one. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Our next speaker is Jessica Groome. She holds an MFA from the University of Guelph and a BFA in visual arts from Emily Carr, and has taught as a sessional instructor at the University of Guelph and Emily Carr. She's developed a studio practice in Vancouver, Toronto, and currently Berlin, where she originally traveled as the recipient of the prestigious Joseph Plaskett Painting Award in 2011. Her work stems from an interest in color, form, reduction, repetition, surface, gesture, and cutting. Welcome, Jessica.
Hi, thank you so much, and thanks for that as well. It's a nice place to pick up. Thinking about the studio and the artist and the universe, what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 images is my relationship to the studio as an artist, and also my collaborative relationship to the studio with another artist that I work with. So the starting point that I'd like to begin with is this image from circa 1951 of Matisse's studio. And I came across this image when I was doing my master's and doing my research for my work at that time. And the thing that really struck me about it was this bizarre construction in the middle of the room where I imagined and projected Matisse would climb up to the top and sit in this chair and use this as kind of a viewing platform to contemplate his work. And I've been thinking about this image for years, obviously, and the thing that I really connect to with this is both the absurdity of such a structure and the set of the logic of the structure at the same time. And I think that this is something as artists we can really relate to as a tool in the studio, and kind of thinking of this as a starting off point into kind of entering the space of what studios can be. This is an image from 2011 of my studio at the University of Guelph. And what I started to think about a lot at this time was the relationship between painting, what I was making in the studio, and the studio as an environment. So thinking about the things I was making in the studio in relation to light, time of day, and works in relation to one another. So not thinking of painting as these isolated instances or just pictures in and of themselves, but thinking about the works in relation to each other and also about the works in relation to a room. This is an image from 2015 of my studio in Toronto. And this is painted paper, large-scale painted paper lined up and ready for decisions to be made. So at this point, they're just colored surfaces in a room in relation to each other. And this is a point of contemplation, a point of looking at these things and just thinking about them. And this act of just looking and thinking and having the space to do this is something that I think is not unique to the studio, but something that maybe is emphasized by being in a studio, and something that I don't often think about at all outside of that space. And this is taken from the exact same perspective in the same studio, probably a couple months later. So after decisions had been made and the paper had been cut and forms had come out of those pieces of paper. So I just thought it was interesting kind of coming from this contemplative space before decisions, the decisions of color were there, but not the decisions of form. Another thing that happens in the studio, if you have the luxury of having a space for a long period of time, is that things kind of hang around in the space and they might change from one initial instance to where you think it's finished. So this is a composite image of 2 blue circles that floated around my studio for over a year. So on the left is where I started with them, where they're just 2 circles side by side with smaller collaged circles on top. And then several months later, they became pieces which sat underneath sculptures. And then maybe several months after that is the point on the right of resolution, where they became the basis for drawings that went on top of them. So this process, again, of looking and thinking and letting things develop throughout a duration of time and being open to transformation, I think is also another interesting condition of the studio. And this is the work of Circles and Wigs, which is my collaborative practice with Ashley Bartlett. This is an installation that we made together in my studio in Toronto in 2015. And we started collaborating because we wanted to kind of escape that isolation and that solitary state that you can find yourself in often as a painter. And we wanted to kind of break out of that a bit and to discover what would happen if we both brought elements from our studio that we didn't consider to be resolved work together into one space. So the premise was very simple. I kind of nervously or anxiously will cut circles when I'm alone in the studio or when I'm thinking about what I'd like to do, but I don't know what to do. And she would often make these cut paintings, which she refers to as wigs, which you can see are these kind of floppy pom-pom-like things that are hanging out next to the circles. So we brought these two kind of disparate elements from our studio practice that were a result of working or anxiety or thought, and we combined them together to create this installation. So coming from a place, as Alison said, of not knowing, and then working together to make sense of these two elements. So this was in 2015, and we've continued to work together ever since. And so our working together takes its form of us visiting each other's studios. So in 2016, she came to my studio in Berlin, and I also got the opportunity to go to her studio in Boston. So these residencies will last for about 2 to 3 weeks. And in this time, we go to the studio together every day and we make work together. So this is just a composite image of us working in her studio in Boston last year in 2016. The foam that you see in the image is from her studio building, which is in a foam factory. So we took the foam that was already there and we traded donuts for foam. And we were very popular, and we got 2 giant, ridiculous bags of foam to use. And so the studio existed inside and outside. And this is an image from 2016 as well, from Berlin in my studio. And we started, for the first time ever, creating drawings together. And so we started off on a small scale, passing drawings back and forth, and also directing each other about what to do with a drawing. And we then scaled up from there and created a number of these, what we ended up calling two-step and combo drawings. So a two-step drawing is pretty self-explanatory. It's when there are 2 visible decisions. Each decision will be made by each of us. So, for example, on the left with the pink circles, I made the spray painted lines, and she then simply colored it in with the yellow. And so then the combo drawings are the ones that we tried to resolve as 2-step drawings, but they got overworked or something didn't go right. And so they end up becoming these like overworked catastrophes like you see in the middle drawing there. And this is an example of us taking the spray painted bits of foam that you see here, and then taking them back into the space and installing them. And so this involves a process of us kind of switching back and forth and directing each other as to where things should go. And this is an example of a studio that we made into kind of a portable studio outside, where we began this process of passing drawings back and forth. And what eventually became the large-scale drawings that we made several weeks later, these. And so I guess what I wanted to say about the studio is that it really has changed for me, whether it's just me by myself alone in the studio, or whether it's working with my collaborative partner, whether we're actually physically together or planning things over a distance, whether I have a studio long-term or whether I'm doing a residency. All of these kind of factors influence the type of work that I'm able to do there. And I think it's interesting kind of comparing all of these things and thinking about how they affect what you do. And yeah, that's what I have to say about the studio. Thanks.
Thank you, Jess. Lastly, we have Jinny Yu. Born in Seoul, South Korea, Yu studied at Concordia University and York University, and is now an associate professor of painting at the University of Ottawa. Her work has been shown widely, including exhibitions in Canada, Germany, Japan, Italy, Portugal, South Korea, UK, and the USA. Her practice is an inquiry into the medium of painting as a means of trying to understand the world around us. Her work presented during the 56th Venice Biennale addresses important themes about migration, which resonate with larger political concerns globally. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are from coast to coast on Indigenous land. In this presentation, I will try to decipher what happens during the process of making in the studio and also beyond. I will discuss 3 points by going through examples of my past works, and I will end the presentation by sharing what my current concerns. I begin by talking about how my thoughts about painting evolve and how that evolution manifests beyond studio and into the exhibition space for certain projects, such as this one called Tiepolo Project. It started with my questioning what painting was, and I kind of narrowed it down to 2 main elements. Painting being autonomous, but never really independent of the space that it's in. In other words, painting reclaiming its sort of non-autonomous state in a way. And 2, the relationship or tension between materiality of paint and illusional space. This original Tiepolo painting, as it is today, embodied both of those concerns and qualities. This painting that's made in situ at the Chiesa dei Santi Cosma e Damiano in Giudecca in 1732, and on display at the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice today, was quite badly conserved for a couple of centuries. But the gallery decided to exhibit it as such, judging that the vitality of painting came through despite the damage. When I saw this painting in 2009, I felt that it completely embodied the 2 elements of what, for me, constituted contemporary painting then. What I mean by this is that the striations that are lacking in paint, so that the space is physically further from us by micromillimeter, but is visually closer to us. But the painted surface, on the other hand, is physically closer to us, also by micromillimeters, but is there to paint an illusion that describes a space that's beyond the surface. So this Tiepolo struck me as perfectly embodying my understanding of what contemporary painting was then. And when Confederation Center for the Arts Gallery commissioned me a work for this space, I wanted to simply show what contemporary painting was for me then. And short of being able to bring the original Tiepolo to Canada, I made a copy in oil paint on aluminum, complete with the striations scratched on top. It was made in 22 pieces, and since the closest that the viewers could get to the painting was about 7 feet away, I decided to break the image by mixing up the panels. And a couple more years of painting in the studio later, making works like these, continuing to question what painting was for me, my thought had evolved in thinking about painting as a verb rather than a noun. Plus, I realized that time was an integral element in painting, both in the process of making and looking. In short, for me, painting began to claim an existence of its own. So when I was installing this Tiepolo project at McMaster Museum of Art, the room was a bit shorter than the work. And so I decided to show it as if it existed, the work existed, despite the physical constraints of the space. So acknowledging painting as a being, I let it continue to exist, despite the wall. So it protrudes into another space, and on the other end, it is bent. And since we could get closer to the work, to see the details of striations, I reordered the panels in proper sequence to follow Tiepolo's work. This is a few months later, as I continued to consider consider painting as a verb. This meant that imagery was no longer important in painting for me, and that anything that was painted was a painting. So this idea, I discovered later, was a bit flawed, but at that time I was quite excited by it. And so here again, I decided to make the painting exist despite the physical constraint. And in this case, I continued the painting by painting. So in other words, I continued the imagery by my simple act of painting the column. So by doing this, I was negating the importance of imagery and overtly claiming painting as a verb, as an act. The column is painted in situ, in ink. Another thing that I did was to physically and literally extend the illusional space of the painting by about 4 meters between the column and the wall. So in a way, viewers physically enter into the painting. And with this example, so with this Tiepolo project example, I tried to describe what the evolution in thinking, in my thinking, which originated in the studio practice, applies not only within the studio, but also beyond to exhibition space. Now I would like to shift to talk about what happens in the studio. So in this case, materiality of painting presented to me an understanding of my experience in the world, and I explain. So this is made with Korean ink that is sprayed on aluminum. And I thought that water-based mediums such as ink would not adhere to a smooth surface such as aluminum, but it does, as you can see. And as I was thinking about this puzzle, I realized that I was like the Korean ink a little bit, which seems to stick to its environment quite well. I thought I wouldn't function so well in this world, but somehow I seem to function quite well. And also, like this painting, which state is quite precarious, since any change in humidity can alter its state, my existence was also very dependent on the environment, like us all. So this work sort of mimicked my existence in this world and extended to mimic the state of our existence for me. I paint on aluminum because it's already a painting even before I start painting. The bare part of the aluminum reflects the world onto which ink sticks and literally represents the world. This is the same work seen from another angle, reflecting a different world. And this is the third part. I will now move on to talk about how process of project, how the process of project coming together extends beyond the studio space for me. This is a work called Don't They Ever Stop Migrating that I presented at the last Biennale in Venice. I will use this as an example to demonstrate how some projects come together with influences beyond the studio, implicating our political reality, history of materiality, and also social network. So I will list a few things that were influential in conceiving this project. As I was going through many bad ideas to arrive at this project, I had a chance to visit a church in Vicenza, just outside of Venice, where I was quite struck by the whiteness of the interior. And as I was exiting, I noticed a couple of fresco fragments near the entrance door. You can see barely in the photo. That looked like they were recovered. So I asked the church attendant what they were, and he told me that this church was used as a quarantine center during the bubonic plague. And so what they did is they kept covering this interior that was once filled with fresco paintings with this paint called calce, which is whitewash in English, and which actually has an antimicrobial function. In other parts of the world, it is still used, like you see in the middle picture, upper middle picture, to protect trees like that. And as someone who extracted meaning from the materiality of paint, the fact that paint had a medical function really fascinated me. And at the same time, on the news, migration crisis was starting to surface as a major problem in Europe, and particularly in Italy. So I'm just showing you a few elements that sort of that affected me in putting together this project. And so when I can't sleep, I listen to some podcasts, and I particularly like this one by my favorite Korean author, Kim Young-ha. And that day, he was reading Albert Camus' La Peste in memory of the victims of Sewol ferry accident in South Korea that killed close to 300 people, mostly school children. And so this got me to reread La Peste. Another element at around the same time that came to me was I was browsing through a Facebook feed, and I fell upon this image which somehow caught my attention, and so I rewatched the movie The Birds. And so all these elements combined, minus all other elements that I have filtered out, made me consider the fear that I have of the unknown. For example, in the movie The Birds, the reaction of characters is very similar to our society's reaction to migrants, and also my reaction to whatever I consider to be different. I feel that it is an innate reaction that we all have as animals, and that our bodies have not really progressed as much as our society needs them to be. And as someone who has experienced both sides of migration, I wanted to question and face my own fear of the others, and by extension, ask us, the viewers, who often pride ourselves of being inclusive. I wanted to ask ourselves whether, by thinking that we are inclusive, we are maybe simply avoiding to face our own fear of the other. I felt that by deeply examining our fear could lead to a start of a conversation with whoever we consider to be on the other side. And so I made this work, which traveled to the rooms in St. John's in Canada. And so in Canada, instead of people walking straight into the work from the street, to the work and slash issue directly from the street, I installed it within a gallery, simulating how we in Canada face the issue of migration with some option and with some distance as well. This is a view from the inside, and I would inside out, and I would like to now play a sound that was a part of this work.
Why? You don't think there's something going around, do you? What's happening? They're frightening the children.
So this sound was playing within this installation. So it doesn't necessarily give you the experience, but you get a little bit of an idea. I would like to end this presentation by opening up to what I have been considering lately. So after this work, I started to enter into a state of panic, observing the strengthening of the right-wing tendency, and also definitely panicked after the Brexit and the result of the US presidential election. And we are witnessing this trend to continue. Last week's German election result is a clear proof. So I looked to the past to see what other artists and citizens had done and to resist, and I came to the conclusion that we had to sort of get organized and to band together. And so I did what I could. Founded a collective called Republic of the Other, where 3 of us artists make work that are sort of text-based. One is based in Berlin, 2 of us are based in Ottawa. And our studio practice sometimes occur over Skype, and I'd be sort of happy to talk about that part as well as we go into the discussion. In the last little while, as I worked in collaboration with my colleagues and also continue in my studio practice, I went through a stage where I wanted to believe that art could directly change this world, to considering that the timing in art may work differently. And I confess that my thoughts do keep shifting as I keep making, painting these self-portraits and trying to find out what I can do in this world. My latest find is very much in line with what Nikolai Chernyshevsky said in 1853 in his essay, The Aesthetic Relations of Art to Reality, that is that art is a substitute for reality in the event of its absence and can be a manual for life. Thank you very much for your attention.
No. Working now? All right, fantastic. Well, thank you to my 3 panelists. That was really insightful and fantastic. I think it brought us through a really interesting transition to open up to a discussion, firstly starting with Sandra having us consider how the studio might be a model for the universe, how we can, through understanding ourselves, through our studio work, we can understand the world through this relationship of the studio as the universe. And then through to Jess, walking us through a little bit about how art making within the studio is both absurd and logical, rational at the same time, walking us through that decision-making process and having us consider kind of the improvisation and transformation that happens within the studio. And then Jinny, again, allowing us to consider how art might help us understand, or art making might help us understand our place in the world, but still bring it out to that question that I think we keep coming at, which is how does art affect the world? What is that relationship between art and the world? And that final comment that she talked about as art being a substitute for reality as a nice starting point to talking about studios. As I presented in the beginning, my place as an art educator allows me to kind of examine the studio from a particular angle. And for me, having spent all this time in studios, I find that to be the most exciting place to investigate what painting is, to move it beyond these tropes or cliches of the studio. For me, through examining and listening to all these stories and kind of those individual experiences, it helps me realize how painting is and can be more than that, and what that role is of painting in society. So what I'm wanting to do now, rather than ask individual questions, I'm hoping we can have a bit of a conversation. We've got about a half hour, so we'll have a bit of a conversation and then open it up to you. I thought a good place to start would be the discussion that the word that intrigued me last night was vitalist fantasy. Talking to so many artists in their studios, the energy with which they talk about their work and their process was just undeniable to me, and also something I've experienced as an artist myself. I took kind of the term vitalist fantasy last night to be referring to almost a performance that artists are taking on in the studio. However, having talked to so many artists about their process, I think it actually might be an interesting way to engage with that embodied making, working through materials and ideas within the studio. So I just want to put it out there as a pretty open-ended question. What does that term, vitalist fantasy, mean to you, or how might that help you frame what you do in the studio?
Yeah, well, let me jump in. Is this thing on? Mm-hmm. Form is a thing, and it's very real. And if you put your vitalism into your form, it's real. It's not a performance of something. Mm-hmm. It's not an idea. It's a thing.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to kind of add or respond to that?
I think we also had this conversation about, not here, but off table, about how this experience of making work and the work sort of talking to us, and us having a conversation with the work is a true experience, as Sandra is saying, and I sort of thought about how it is similar to kind of a religious experience, where when it's looked at from outside, those kinds of true experiences seem kind of ridiculous in certain way, and maybe could seem performative as well, like people speaking tongue or something. But I think when there is this kind of experience, it is quite true for the person who is experiencing. And I quite liked how Sandra talked about studio as universe, and then leading to universal, which I think for the person, for the artist, is true. It is the universe, and hence becomes universal, and hopefully it does become universal. But in any case, within that kind of perspective, it is a very true experience. So, yeah.
Yeah, so you're saying there's a sincerity that you approach the work with. Yeah, I would also say the same thing. It definitely doesn't feel, when you're making something, like it's a performance, or like you're picturing kind of the end point strategically as to where it might be, or how it, for me anyway, in the moment where the work is in the studio, I try to push those kinds of thoughts out of my mind, because it's the relationship between myself as the person making it and the thing being made. And I kind of stop it at that, just for my own sanity.
Thank you. So I guess that, again, kind of considering what's happening in the studio, the next question is, why does that experience of the artist, why is that significant? What role does that play in terms of what painting is outside the studio? And I thought you just touched on it right at the end, Jinny, and I thought maybe you could expand a bit more on what you were saying about art as a substitute to reality, and what that means to you. Now, I know that you say you're in this still thinking it through phase, but what does that mean to you with regards to then, what is that role of painting or art?
Well, like the way Nikolai Chernyshevsky talked about, art being a substitute for reality was actually quite sobering, a reading of what art was. He's like totally putting art not like on the pedestal as something like grandiose, but something that, like the example that he gives is actually a landscape. So, if we live in a space where we don't have a view of a nice seascape, then we get a painting that has seascape, so in that sense of substitute for reality. But I kind of also took it, so it was very sobering kind of analysis, a bit like what I felt yesterday, sobering sort of analysis of art, not putting it as a special category, but something as an experience, and so that is sort of what he talks about in terms of substituting reality. But in a way, I think the studio becomes sort of a reality for us. So me extending that analysis to my situation. So I think it's sort of like, in a way, I feel sometimes in the studio that I could alter, it's kind of like fantasy. I can change my reality by doing certain things, and in certain other times, it's more like me feeling like reading my reality, my place in the world, and really being a bit depressed by it as well. And so I think there's that. But then the second point that he makes about it being manual of life is he sort of talks about art and science in the same breath, and how science analyzes nature and becomes like a manual of life. The way science does, art does, could also do in the same way, where we analyze our world through whatever we do, and it could become manual of life, that's where my thoughts are these days. Yeah. But I do use the experience of studio practice as a way of really, I think there's a lot of time of contemplation that happens that we're really privileged as artists to have, and to be able to think about what's going on and where am I, that sort of like really big philosophical questions. But I don't think that it's just artists who do that, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that idea of contemplation is really interesting, and it's something that you also brought up, that idea that just having that time and space to contemplate, and how significant that is with having a studio. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all.
Yeah, the type of contemplation, I mean, there's different types of contemplation. The one that I exercise in the studio more than anywhere else is the type of contemplation that goes along with looking at things and moving things around, which sounds extremely simple, but if I were to break down what I do into two things, it would be looking and moving things around. And that is what the studio allows me to do.
Good. Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to I'm going to ask first if the panel would like to ask anything of each other before I open it up to the audience for questions. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question, I have a question, I suppose, to Sandra, and I guess others as well. It's a question about where do you place the haptic or the painterly gesture in your model of artistic thought?
Hat-trick?
Haptic, the painterly gesture.
Okay, I like hat-trick too.
Because it seems that you focused on the primacy of the visual, right? And I suppose another question would be, where do you position the gesture, your gesture, in response to the long, I guess, history of painting in the 20th century, which was all about the critique of the gesture, or the depletion of the gesture, to use the words of Benjamin Buclot, and it wasn't necessarily a vitalist fantasy, right? It was a type of anti-vitalist project.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think all painting involves gesture. I mean, you're using goop and a brush and movement to apply, or a line, or if you draw. But I don't really concern myself too much with historical critique of painting. Maybe I do on a subconscious level, and it's all there. But I guess I don't like my work to address it directly. Maybe for me that's moving away from myself, which is what I want to get at, not myself, but the self. So, I mean, painting is all about visual tricks and what color do you mix with what to make what, and how to use contrast and line and all of that stuff. So those are all haptic. And sometimes chance really plays a big part, and you just have to go with it, right? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of where I'm at with the gesture, I guess, if that makes sense. Anybody else?
Yeah. Where's our microphone? Right there.
Yes, I feel compelled now to to just say, because this term vitalist fantasy has stuck quite obviously, and I just wanted to be a bit more precise about it and remind you that it doesn't have only positive connotations in my use of it. It's a critical concept, and what I mean is that on the one hand there are vitalist fantasies of many types that are generated and triggered by painting also, and painters are often aware of this and kind of know how to produce these fantasies. But I also said that the vitalist fantasy is so popular because it allows us to ignore conflict, inequalities, and everything that doesn't smoothly just move forward in a vitalistic élan vital type way. So I said basically that the vitalist fantasy suggests a life without negativity, a life without class struggle. So for me, it's a concept that is actually meant as a critical concept, that I just wanted to kind of, maybe it didn't come across so clearly yesterday. But the question I actually would have now to all of you, what I'm really interested in is the way the studio gets re-evaluated after post-studio practice. I mean, we have had many decades since the 70s where, the studio had a pretty bad reputation, and many artists opted for a kind of project-based, office-type administrative work. Then we realized that that this kind of work correlates very well with what a neoliberal society wants us to do, which is being flexible, being cooperative, not having a fixed space where we work, being mobile, And this implies for me the return of the studio, the new popularity of the studio. I think there are social reasons for this, and especially when we think about painters, because the painter, is associated with a type of labor that is comparatively self-determinate. If you compare it to someone, say, working in an advertising agency, the painter has more freedom. There are external constraints entering the studio, yes, but compared to any other creative worker, you have your own product, you can decide upon its purposes, you have comparatively more freedom. And that's maybe where the current fascination in painting also lies, because it implies this type of labor, which is actually unimaginable, which is possible for nearly nobody. It's a type of labor creative workers of all kinds can only dream of. And maybe.
I think, the negative connotations of the vitalist fantasy were not lost on us at all.
Yeah.
No, it's good.
I agree with you in terms of sort of the returning to studio practice as something that's happening. And as I was sort of considering, like, what can I do in this world to resist, and the first thing, as being so lazy a person and being a lazy armchair Marxist or something, I was thinking that just being a studio-based artist is actually a resistance to the world, and just taking time, making things, thinking about things that is unproductive from the economic sort of system could be, I was just trying to feel good about myself, I guess, but I felt that sort of like one way I felt that justifies my studio practice, and also that appeals, like how the studio practice appeals to me as well. And then, there are, of course, other things that I have to do and that some of us should do. But I think studio practice, spending time there, being unproductive in the way the world sees the time, I think is a way of resisting.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I think the abandonment of the studio is a myth. I remember in the 90s, Roland Brenner sailed around the world, and he came back and he said, I'm not going to ever make any art anymore, and I'm never going to show in a museum because that's all passé and nobody's doing that anymore. So he did that for about 2 weeks. I think also I wanted to say that I am an artist because it gives me a great deal of freedom. I feel amazingly freedom in my studio, and that's what attracts me to it. But I don't deny the fact that my work is a commodity, and the work of all artists are commodities that's readily picked up on by the culture at large, and used and influenced and back and forth in the capitalist world. There's a question.
Yep, there first. Oh, sorry, okay. You next, promise.
Here.
Yeah, all right. No, you're first, and then Lanika. Oh gosh, okay, you guys decide.
All right, well, I'll pass it over in a minute. Thanks. One of the confusing things about the way the studio has been used, I think, here, it sort of connotes that old idea of sort of, I think, male and alone and in the garret and sort of infinitely self-contained and wise and quite privileged, actually. Mm-hmm. And I know that you've done a lot of research, Alison, looking at the studios of reality. Is a lot of young artists way prefer the performative. They like working in sort of collective studios, and they time share and they bang into each other. They're living in really small, tiny little places, certainly in Vancouver. They understand that materials are toxic, messy, yada, yada. And for me, the thing that hadn't come up really, all the pictures are like of studios, of people alone, of people contemplatively like rummaging around with their stuff and their material, but that's not really the reality. I mean, I've always been in big collective studios in Montreal or here in Vancouver. A bunch of us have been in the same building for 30 years. It really matters that we noticed that we got up and came to so-called work or got out of bed and bother. But I also think of Louise Bourgeois says she had her first outside studio. She was 70 years old. Joyce Wayland, a really important Canadian artist, didn't have a studio outside the home till 1960, 61, on the 1 or 2 years that she and Mike Snow lived in New York. There's so many indicators of the studio, and I was really struck with Charlene Vickers' earlier talk of the territory of oneself that she used, of like, I'm sure, whether it's the kitchen table or a studio in Chinatown or a big table under a tree, for a lot of us, the studio is a mobile sort of headspace. I mean, I've been at the Banff Center where I actually chose just to have a big board under a tree because I didn't want to take space around from younger artists who I thought should use it or needed it. So can you just comment a little bit more and expand this, because I was getting a very romantic notion of the studio. And I do agree, though, that my generation came out of conceptual art where we were, in a way, reacting to the Catholicism of conceptual art. I was, educated in Halifax, as other people might have been in the early 70s, where to rebel was really very much to go find a grubby space somewhere, because, again, as Isabel just mentioned, there was sort of a setup, which wasn't like another city, perhaps, or another context where all these fancy big painters are working. And so to rebel, you went into a post-studio situation, but rather that a lot of us were educated in the post-studio situation already in the early 70s.
Mm-hmm. All right. Was that, I guess, for me, kind of question? Well, I don't even know how to begin to answer that question. So, yeah, I mean, I think all those things that you pointed out were very apparent going across Canada, going to studios. I definitely didn't kind of go into depth as I talked about it. With different cities, the different economics, kind of city structures allowed for people to add studios, and that stress of affording a studio and having a studio was definitely apparent the whole way. But I think what struck me a lot was the fact that despite all that, they still had studios. Despite the fact that in Vancouver, most people I know are working like 5 jobs and crammed in a tiny studio. And I think this comes back to what Sandra was saying, that I don't think that the studio was ever really gone, because the people that wanted to have a studio got a studio. And in cities where studios weren't available, they had makeshift ones in their basements. There was a lot of these kind of weird basement studios and things like that. So I don't know if that fully addresses that, but that definitely was very apparent to me. But I think the persistence of having a studio, and I think, that relationship between the private and the social of the studio was definitely something that I was trying to get at with the introduction, and I think Jess kind of got at it as well. However, I think, with my background in education, there's been a lot of emphasis for years within all of education on collaboration and group things. And I think what struck me talking to all these artists was how much they also really liked that solitary contemplative time in the studio as well. So it was important to me to really emphasize that does seem to be very significant to working through those experiences, working through those ideas, which then hopefully, as Sandra and Jinny as well pointed out, become universal in some way when they're put out there. Anyone else want to kind of take on that question a bit?
Yeah, there's definitely a romanticism projected, for sure, for me into the studio, but by no means would I say it comes easy. I also share a studio with 4 other people, and it's also extremely competitive and expensive where I am too. So it's not something that just falls into your lap. And then it is an idealized space, and it is one that like I said, I do kind of project a certain amount of like romanticism on, but it is also one that is, hard won in a certain way, because what I do doesn't actually pay me enough to be able to pay for it. So.
The key thing is it's not domestic. Right?
Yes.
Four women on this panel, 4 women on the last panel. It's not domestic space.
At this moment, no, but it has been in the past. Yeah.
Anyone else want to add before we move on to the next question? All right, up front here.
Well, I dream of having a studio one day. And no, I do. My studio right now is a sort of makeshift corner in my 1-bedroom apartment, right? Or 1-bedroom condominium. And it's filling up with canvases and, work is lying all over the place. And sometimes when, I look at all this in front of me, I think, that's okay, Art is a part of my everyday life. And, I've done some readings and met First Nations people, and, art was a part of their everyday life. They had no word for the word art, right? And so anyway, thank you for your wonderful presentations. I really enjoyed all of your presentations immensely. And for me, when I think of my makeshift studio, I do feel it's kind of like a universe, especially when my work is going very, very well. I feel kind of connected to the life force, literally, the energy coming, the life force of the universe sort of channeling it and onto the canvas, right? I get that kind of, and for me it's about feeling, and that's why I paint. I paint for that feeling, to get to that feeling, right? And then, for Jesse, you were talking about how you're moving things around, and you're moving things around. It's about transformation and so on. There's unresolved work. I have some unresolved work that's kind of looking for solutions as well, and it'll come, and I just leave it there. But I love your idea of sort of putting your unresolved work along with another artist's unresolved work and seeing if it'll kind of find a solution, right? So I think that's so neat. And Jinny, your work, don't they ever stop migrating? The birds, and I've used this metaphor of birds for migration as well in a mixed media collage, except all my birds are coming from all different directions to Canada, settling here. So it's extremely disturbing for me as well when I think of the rise of right wing or white identity politics or white consciousness, whatever you want to call it, and and it's actually the gulf between us and them, me and the other. It's really widened. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Shared some thoughts.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question right there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Fascinating conversation about painting as thinking. I have a question for Sandra Meeks. Could you talk a little bit about making art and quantum physics? Like you mentioned that earlier, and is there some way you could elaborate on that?
I got really trying to understand quantum physics, which I can't say that I do. But I think space and time and illusion is what drew me to it as a painter. That's what we deal with. And I also project imagination as a reality in a mini instant. So, I mean, when I'm looking at something as a model, it's not as if I just made this huge masterpiece that's going to put it all together for you and aha, that's the whole secret. It's all just fleeting like that, and that's how I see a work of art. It's a fleeting attachment to minute, tiny little subatomic particle. And it'll take you anywhere. That's my quantum physics.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
And I think that that's a great place to end on. Thank you again to Jinny, Sandra, and Jessica.